It's time we talked about what web forms are all about. So I have a bit of a PowerPoint to lead us through this introduction to this technology. Uh, it's kind of a unique web technology. Even still today, it's one of the few that all from the server side, let me emphasize that from the server side, is able to simulate basically working in a regular Windows form application, interactively, event-driven, et cetera, right? Now, one of the things you should be aware of is, yes, Microsoft developed it, but it is now totally open source, which is a great thing if you're a great supporter of open source, as I think most developers are. It also means that you can use it to generate income for yourself. You don't have to worry about owing anything to Microsoft for the privilege of using ASP.NET. It is in the open source community, supported by the open source community, and of course, Microsoft still does a lot of work contributing to it. It does run on the .NET framework. Now, you've probably heard a lot lately about .NET Core, the newer, better, quote, 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 version of the .NET framework. It's doubtful if ASP.NET Webforms will ever transition over to .NET Core. Right now, it still requires a .NET framework, but it works, and it works really well, and it's widely used in the world. So it's good to be somewhat aware of it. I doubt too many of you, like I, have gone through the evolution of ASP from 1.0 to 2.0 and so on. But you might have done more likely some work with PHP. And the basic scripting of those languages is still somewhat indicated here inside of WebForms, but it's come a long way from them. It's kind of an evolution, though, and it was building on top of that basic server-side script approach. Okay. What makes it different now is, of course, we have advanced controls, user interface controls that encapsulate, as it says here, common functionality, right? So you can stick one of these controls on your web form, your web page, and it's set up to do certain things for you automatically, right? There is a WYSIWYG, or what you see is what you get, design support in this. It's pretty good, better than many. And one thing I like about it is it doesn't inject a whole bunch of styles and things like some of the other ones out there that you don't want and don't need, and it doesn't clutter up your code with its own preferences that way. You can create it directly through code. You can just use Notepad if you want and create your web forms that way. You don't have to use Visual Studio, but it makes life much easier with IntelliSense and so on, right? And the other unique thing about it is these controls and the technology in general will do what's often referred to as browser sniffing and see what the capability of the client browser is and figure out the best way to get a certain task accomplished. In other words, if it can do it with dynamic HTML and maybe some JavaScript, great. It'll use that on the client side to give you more efficiency. If the client browser isn't capable of those technologies, maybe it's an older one or has some limitations or things turned off, well, then the software on the server will detect that and come up with an alternate approach. It might not work quite as elegantly, but it will get the job done. So the idea is making it work in the end, no matter what, right? So it can generate the kind of code the browser supports and adjust automatically for compatibility, right? Another nice thing about it is compared to those older technologies, especially, it gives you as it says, cleanly structured page logic. In other words, you have basically an HTML page with the extension ASPX, and then there's a code behind page. And all the event handlers and most of the C# or Visual Basic code goes in the code behind page, and just the HTML goes in the ASPX page. So it gives that separation so designers can work on making the page look pretty in their browser, and programmers can work on the programming code in the background, right? Okay. All right, now you should be aware that this technology also gives you a chance on the server to access and manipulate attributes of any HTML element, or pretty much all of them anyway. All you have to do is add an attribute, run at equals server. And that along with an ID, of course, inside of an element, whether it's a div or anything else, an H2 tag, for example, right? You can manipulate the attributes in your code on the server. There's no real disadvantage to this, but of course there's limitations that are outshone, so to speak, by the newer ASP.NET server controls, which generate different kinds of code and so on as well to get, as we said earlier, the job done. All right, so server controls. Okay, basically what we're looking at is run at equals server, but also the tag usually starts with ASP. Now you might wonder what that is, but essentially it's a namespace. When you view the code that comes down to the browser, you will never see that ASP. It will actually generate the appropriate HTML for the client browser, right? And that's basically what you get. So it's on the server side, we write the code that way, but it generates often vanilla HTML, for lack of a better term, on the client as well, right? So another way to put that is at runtime, the server controls automatically generate the HTML content, and it can vary depending on browser capabilities. So before we go any further, it's probably good to get into an example. So I could have just pulled up the one from yesterday, but I want to go through this again. I had some emails from students. Just one thing in particular caught a couple of them by surprise. So when you go to create a new project, I mentioned before, you can start, there's so many in here. You can start by typing web, right? And you got to be careful though, okay? So we don't want core, right? We want ASP.NET Web Application with .NET Framework. But look at this, Visual Basic came up in the list first. Well, you might think, because that's the only difference between this one and the one we want, is that it mentions Visual Basic. So it's not a bad thing. I love Visual Basic, but that's probably not what we want to do. We're all focused on learning C#, so we'll skip over that one. I'll come down and find the ASP.NET Web Application with C#, right? And that's the one we're going to select. Okay, so here we are again. So configure your new project. You might want to just double check for that C# there to make sure that you actually have the one that you want. So let me just come in here. I'm going to do what I typically do, right? I'll go to my C drive, make a new folder for my work. And then I can pick that up and move it later on wherever I want, right? Okay, now I'm going to call this just something like first demo. We're just going to go through some of the basics of how this overall technology works, right? I can just leave the latest framework. That doesn't make a huge problem for me. Okay, so again, I'll go with empty, but selecting Webforms, and no, I don't want to be restricted to HTTPS, at least not yet. Okay, so I'll just click Create. So we were here the other day with our first database example with our art house, but kind of skipped over everything else inside here. We just focused on the app_data folder, right? So let me just talk a bit about what else you see here. Not everything, but a couple of the important things. Web config file. Well, as the name suggests, it's a configuration file. It's XML, which is something you are probably pretty familiar with by now. If not, then you should understand quickly at a glance that XML is really the standard to which most markup languages are trying to emulate or they're based on XML, even HTML itself, right? Rules like opening and closing tags and so on and so forth. Attributes have quotes and things like that, attribute assignments and so on. All right, so it's a configuration file, and one of the reasons why we're going to have to come into here regularly is we start off with the empty template. Now, if you select the full Webform template, then you get, I think I mentioned before, all kinds of good stuff, JavaScript libraries and Bootstrap and this thing and that thing. And one of the things that most modern browsers support with JavaScript is what's called Unobtrusive Javascript. It's a very slick and nice way to provide validation on a web page so that something cannot be left blank or a number has between two values and things like that, right? Without unobtrusive JavaScript and the libraries being provided, this Webform application can work around that limitation of not having the convenience of unobtrusive JavaScript, but we have to let it know not to expect it to be on the client. So until we get around to later on perhaps playing around with the full Webform template, we need to put a little bit of extra code in here. So you might as well get in the habit as soon as you start a new project, I should have done it the other day as well, but we hadn't introduced it yet. Come right here, anywhere between configuration and slash configuration. Now, where you're going to get the code? Well, I put it up in our weekly folder, but it's also under content by category right near the top. There's a little text file you can copy from, but you know what? I found that all you really need is to grab it right out of the HTML here, and it seems to work. So this is a fix. If you ever got an error that talks about unobtrusive JavaScript, it's because you forgot to do this, right? So I'll just, I'm going to hit tab. I'll just throw that in here. It's an application setting. Pardon my coughing. No, I don't believe I have COVID. Okay, unobtrusive validation mode, none, right? So that just tells the system don't expect the libraries for unobtrusive, see that 3 times really fast, JavaScript. Okay, so that's other configuration things going to go in here later on. In particular, the one we're going to be using is a connection string, right? Whenever we connect to a database, a SQL server, and so on, we use a connection string, and we can store it in the configuration file. That way it's in one spot, and that way we can, if we ever need to modify it, we can change it in one place. So that's something we're going to end up putting in here as well. Okay, so that's that file. I'll just quickly mention the global ASAX. This is a sort of a global event handler for the entire application, which is why we see application start. So if you had any code you wanted to run every time the application starts, also in here you can put things like application end to clean things up. There's also session start and session end, right? Session basically is every time a new user comes to your web application, it generates a new session, and they'll usually get a session cookie to track their conversation with the web application back and forth and so on. Right? Those session cookies usually time out after about 20 minutes if they haven't been used. Okay, so that is the kind of code you can put in here. We'll come back to that later on if necessary. Probably won't be in this 6 weeks. All right, models is a folder where later on we'll put some classes that can use to dynamically generate some validation. App data is where we put data, and I'm not going to worry about the rest for now. All right, but one thing missing, we don't have a web form, right? So I can add one. So if I just go down to add, I could say a new item, but you know what? It's pretty good at guessing things we might want. And way down here, see HTML page, JavaScript, style sheets, web forms, and so on. So it's a web form page. That's what we're after, right? I'm going to call this first one default. You may or may not be aware, but most web servers have a series of names. If you just type in a URL, just like the server, Microsoft.com, right? Well, all web servers, when they look inside that sort of folder and look for a file to display, right? And it will go through a series of names, index, default, and then for each of those, of course, it's configurable. You can add other ones as well, but those are the two most common ones. And for each of those, though, it'll start checking extensions. Is there index HTML? If not, is there index.aspx? If not, it'll look for other extensions, index.php and so on, right? So it goes through until it finds a file to display. So having a head start here with default ASPX just means that the web server can quite possibly find this and display it automatically.